Franklin Boon, an 82-year-old veteran, rides his vintage Harley through a quiet Montana town, unnoticed by most. Officer Dana Kelso, driven by protocol, stops him, mistaking his silence for defiance and his old bike for a hazard. Unbeknownst to her, Boon is a revered colonel with a heroic past. As tensions rise at a gas station, a military convoy arrives, led by Captain Graves, who salutes Boon with reverence. The soldier's presence unveils his extraordinary legacy, leaving Dana stunned and the town buzzing. What secrets does Boon's silence hold, and how will this encounter reshape their lives? If Colonel Boon's story of quiet heroism touched you, share your thoughts below. Like, subscribe, and share this video to honor those whose stories go untold. Join our community to celebrate dignity and respect. Your support keeps these powerful narratives alive. Thank you for watching and remembering. The sun hung low over the Montana plains, casting long shadows that stretched like fingers across the cracked asphalt of Highway 87. Officer Dana Kelso, 29, swung open the door of her patrol car with a sharp creak, her polished sunglasses glinting with a confidence that bordered on arrogance. "This has got to be some kind of joke," she muttered, her voice barely audible over the hum of the idling engine. Her boots crunched against the gravel shoulder, kicking up tiny clouds of dust as she approached the figure before her. Franklin Boon, 82 years old, sat astride his vintage Harley-Davidson, a weathered machine that growled softly, its chrome dulled but unyielding, like the man himself. His hands, rough and scarred from a lifetime of labor, rested calmly on the handlebars, steady as stone. His steel-gray eyes gazed past her, locked on some distant point beyond the horizon, as if he were waiting for a truth only he could sense. There was no fear in his posture, no confusion, just a quiet patience that made Dana's skin prickle with unease. "License and registration, sir," she said, her tone sharp and commanding, the words slicing through the stillness. Her right hand hovered near the holster at her hip, a reflex born of training and a deeper, unspoken need to assert control. Franklin's silence stretched on, and Dana's jaw tightened. She mistook his stillness for defiance, or perhaps the fog of age, never suspecting that this moment was the prelude to something far greater. Over the rise, the ground trembled faintly, a low rumble growing louder until it filled the air like a gathering storm. 12 military Humvees crested the hill, their tires churning up clouds of dust that swirled like a desert tempest. 50 soldiers dismounted in perfect unison, their boots striking the earth with a cadence that echoed like a heartbeat. From the lead vehicle, a man in crisp fatigue stepped forward, his face etched with respect. He snapped a salute, his eyes locked on Franklin, and spoke 6 words that hung in the air like a thunderclap. "Who dares to stop Colonel Boon?" The words rippled through the empty highway, and for a moment the world seemed to hold its breath. Franklin Boon's life was one of quiet obscurity, a deliberate choice in a world that craved noise and spectacle. His 40-acre farm, nestled just outside Billings, Montana, was a place of simple truths: sun-scorched earth, weathered fence posts, and fields of golden wheat that swayed in the wind like soldiers marching in formation. The sight never failed to stir something deep within him, a flicker of pride that felt both ancient and alive. There were no grand markers of his existence, no gleaming trucks or neon signs, just a sagging barn, a rusted mailbox with Boon scrawled in faded paint, and a man whose silence held more stories than most could imagine. To the people of Billings, Franklin was the old man with the hay bales, a dependable figure who sold to local ranchers at honest prices and never missed a delivery. If you passed him on the road, his black helmet gleaming atop that rumbling Harley, you might catch a glimpse of his face, lined and weathered, but with eyes that seemed to see through time itself. His nod, when he offered one, was no casual gesture. It carried weight, like a quiet vow exchanged between strangers. But the mornings belonged to Franklin alone, sacred hours when the world was still and his heart could speak without interruption. Every day at 5 a.m., he rose from his narrow bed, not because the farm demanded it, but because discipline was the pulse that kept him alive. In the half-light of his bedroom, he'd stretch his aching joints, then lower himself to the worn floorboards for 30 push-ups, each one slow and deliberate, his breath steady as he counted. It was a ritual unchanged since his days in boot camp, a way to honor the young man he'd once been while grounding the old man he'd become. Afterward, he'd pull back the curtains, letting the sharp Montana air fill his lungs, and set the coffee pot to brew while the sun crept over the hills, painting the fields in hues of gold and amber. His home was a study in simplicity, 2 bedrooms, one of which stood as a shrine to his late wife, Della. 20 years had passed since her death, but her photograph still sat on the windowsill, facing east to catch the morning light. Her smile was a quiet anchor, a reminder of love that time could not erase. Franklin rarely entered that room. The memories were too heavy, the loss too raw even now. By 6:30, he was outside, his hands already busy with the tools of his trade. His 1978 John Deere tractor, its green paint chipped and faded, still roared to life under his care. Every bolt and belt tended to like an old comrade. On slower days, he'd retreat to the garage, where his 1970 Harley shovelhead waited, a machine that looked more like a survivor of some forgotten war than a motorcycle. Most would have retired such a relic, but to Franklin, it was a living thing rebuilt by his own hands in 1993, piece by piece, with a patience that bordered on reverence. It wasn't about comfort or speed, it was about purpose, about keeping faith with something that had carried him through darker days. Neighbors sometimes teased him, their voices light but curious, about why he didn't retire, maybe see the world or settle into a rocking chair. Franklin's answer was always the same, delivered with a half smile that lingered just short of his eyes. Idle hands lose their way. It was a creed he lived by, a shield against the temptation to let time erode his resolve. Franklin's world was untouched by the trappings of modernity. He had no smartphone, no interest in Wi-Fi, or the endless chatter of screens. He read newspapers, folding them with care, and paid for supplies with checks written in a steady hand. His home held no trophies, no polished medals or framed certificates, just a pair of scuffed boots by the door, a folded flag in a wooden box, and a man who carried his past with the quiet dignity of someone who'd seen too much to need validation. Every time he climbed onto that Harley and rode into town, Franklin Boon looked like just another old man on an old bike, until someone dared to stop him. Dana Kelso, at 29, was a woman shaped by a hunger for order in a world that often felt like it was so spinning out of control. Raised in a Denver household where rules were the foundation of survival, she'd grown up in the shadow of her father, a corrections officer whose 20-year career had been defined by unyielding discipline. She'd watched him move through life with a spine of steel and a jaw clenched against doubt, believing that structure and consequence were the only things holding cash at bay. That belief had burrowed deep into Dana, driving her to become an officer who saw every moment as a chance to prove her strength, not to others, but to herself. As she stood before Franklin that day, her hand near her weapon, she wasn't just enforcing the law, she was fighting to hold her ground in a universe that felt too big, too uncertain. Franklin's silence unnerved her, not because she sensed danger, but because it defied her need for clarity, for control. She couldn't know that the man before her was no ordinary farmer, that his past was a force about to crash into her present with a weight she could never have anticipated. In the depths of her heart, Dana Kelso held an unwavering conviction. The boundary between right and wrong must remain crystal clear, an unyielding line etched in stone. If ever that line began to blur, it was her solemn duty to carve it sharp again. Joining the police force wasn't merely a career choice for her, it was a calling, a sacred mission to uphold justice with precision and integrity. She envisioned herself as an officer who commanded respect not through intimidation, but through steadfast adherence to the rules. For Dana, order was the bedrock of safe communities, and procedures were the scaffolding that held it all together. Ambiguity, those murky gray areas where decisions wavered, made her skin crawl. In her mind, clarity was safety, deviation was danger. Her time in Denver had tested this belief system, forging it in the crucible of chaos. The department there was a whirlwind of understaffed shifts, relentless emergency calls, and the raw pulse of urban disorder. Dana thrived in the structure she imposed on the mayhem, her meticulous reports and unyielding discipline earning her a reputation as a rookie who could handle the pressure. But the most extracted a toll. The cases that lingered in her mind, scenes of violence, desperation, and loss, clung to her like shadows. No amount of academy training could have prepared her for the weight of those memories, the faces that haunted her quiet moments. After 5 years of chasing crises, her soul felt heavy, her spirit frayed. Seeking solace, she requested a transfer to a small-town department just outside Billings, Montana, hoping the vast open landscapes would offer her a chance to breathe, to heal, and perhaps to climb the ranks in a place where the pace was slower and the stakes less suffocating. In Montana, Dana quickly became known as by-the-book Kelso. Her uniform was always pressed to perfection, her boots gleamed with a weekly polish, and no citation ever went undocumented. Her reports were works of art, meticulous, thorough, every detail accounted for. Yet for all her discipline, Dana sometimes struggled to connect with the human side of her work. It wasn't that she lacked compassion. Rather, she believed emotions could cloud judgment, weaken resolve. To her, duty was a shield, and feelings were a vulnerability she couldn't afford. She didn't mean to seem cold, but her focus on protocol often left others feeling like she was more machine than person, her heart hidden behind the starched fabric of her uniform. Her new partner, Officer Trey Daniels, was her mirror opposite, a man whose easygoing nature both intrigued and unsettled her. At 34, Trey carried himself with a relaxed confidence that bordered on cavalier, at least in Dana's eyes. His casual demeanor, his slightly loosened tie, his habit of leaning against the cruiser during calls, grated against her sense of propriety. Yet, there was no denying his effectiveness. Trey had a gift for connecting with people, a disarming charm that could coax confessions from the guilty and calm the frantic. Raised in nearby Billings, he knew the town's pulse intimately. The back roads, the diner owners, the high school nicknames that lingered into adulthood. After nearly a decade with the department, Trey had seen the undercurrents that Dana was only beginning to glimpse. The slow-burning grudges, the unspoken alliances, the intricate web of loyalties that governed small-town life more than any law ever could. In the field, Trey deferred to Dana's command presence. She had an intensity, a drive that he admired, even if he privately thought she could benefit from trusting her instincts over her rulebook. Dana respected Trey's experience, his ability to read people, but she couldn't shake the feeling that his soft edges invited trouble. To her, rules were armor, protecting not just her, but everyone around her. Mistakes, she believed, were born from leniency, and mistakes could cost lives. That morning, as Dana patrolled the quiet streets of the town, her eyes caught something that pricked her instincts. An old man on a rusted Harley, lingering too long at a red light. To her, the stillness wasn't contemplative, it was suspicious. Her training kicked in, urging her to act, to investigate, to restore order. What she didn't yet understand was that sometimes stillness wasn't a sign of confusion or malice. Sometimes it was the quiet before a moment that would challenge everything she thought she knew. The low, resonant growl of Franklin Boone's vintage Harley rumbled through Main Street, a sound like distant thunder rolling across the serene Montana Valley. The bike was no longer the sleek machine it had once been. Time and wear had softened its edges, much like Franklin himself. But it was reliable, a steadfast companion that carried him through the rhythms of his life. He eased the Harley to a stop just outside Marty's Corner, a weathered gas station that had stood as a town landmark since the late 1960s. Little had changed about the place over the decades. The hand-painted signs, the humming soda fridge, the red bench out front, where locals gathered to swap stories over coffee. The air carried the faint scent of diesel, sun-warmed pavement, and the rich aroma of brewing coffee from inside the station. Franklin's hands were steady as he propped the bike on its stand, his breath calm and even. He didn't remove his helmet, not yet. His plan was simple: top off the tank and get back to the fields before the sun climbed too high. A farmer's life demanded discipline, and Franklin was no stranger to routine. But fate, as it often does, had other designs. The sharp screech of tires on gravel shattered the morning's tranquility. A black and white patrol cruiser pulled into the station's lot with a force that felt almost aggressive, kicking up a cloud of dust. Officer Dana Kelso stepped out first, her mirrored sunglasses masking her eyes but not the firm set of her jaw. Her posture was all business, her movements precise, as if she were a coiled spring ready to act. Behind her, Officer Trey Daniels emerged more slowly, his pace deliberate, his eyes scanning the scene with a quiet curiosity. He adjusted his duty belt, his expression unreadable but calm, a contrast to Dana's intensity. "Sir?" Dana called out, her voice cutting through the air like a blade, authoritative and unyielding. Her hand rested lightly on her holster, not threatening but ready, her training guiding every step. Franklin turned his head slightly, still seated on his Harley, his weathered hands resting on the handlebars. In that moment, the air felt charged, as if the quiet valley held its breath, waiting for what would come next. For Dana, this was a moment to enforce order, to ensure nothing slipped through the cracks. For Trey, it was a moment to observe, to weigh the situation with the instinct Dana so distrusted. And for Franklin, it was a moment that carried the weight of a lifetime, a life Dana and Trey could not yet comprehend. The encounter, simple as it seemed, was the spark of a lesson that would ripple through them all, challenging the foundations of their beliefs and forcing them to confront the fragile line between duty and humanity. The Montana morning stretched out in deceptive calm, the kind that cloaks tension in a veneer of ordinary life. Officer Dana approached Franklin Boon with measured steps, her boots crunching softly against the gravel of the range station lot. Her voice cut through the crisp air, sharp and authoritative, like a blade honed by years of routine patrols. "Sir, can you shut that engine off, please?" she said, her tone clipped, professional, but laced with an edge of impatience. She stood tall, her uniform crisp, her hand resting lightly on her belt, close to her holster. Not a threat, but a reflex born of training. Franklin, perched on his weathered Harley, didn't rush to comply. He turned his head slowly, his eyes catching her reflection in the side mirror of his bike. For a moment, he studied her, not with defiance, but with a quiet, assessing gaze that seemed to see beyond the badge, beyond the moment. Then, without a word, he reached for the ignition and flipped the switch. The Harley's low rumble died, leaving a heavy silence in its wake. But the air grew thicker, charged with an unspoken tension that neither officer nor rider acknowledged aloud. Dana stepped closer, her eyes narrowing slightly as she sized him up. "Mind telling me where you're headed this morning?" she asked, her voice steady but probing. "And can I see your license and registration?" Her words were routine, but beneath them lay a flicker of curiosity, maybe even suspicion. This wasn't just another stop. Something about the old man's stillness, his lack of reaction, unsettled her. Franklin didn't flinch. His movements were deliberate, unhurried, as he reached into the breast pocket of his worn leather jacket. The jacket itself told a story. Scuffed at the elbows, faded from years under the sun, but cared for like a soldier's gear. He pulled out a battered wallet, its leather cracked but intact, and extracted his license and registration. Handing them over, he met Dana's gaze briefly, his expression unreadable. No trace of fear crossed his weathered face, no spark of indignation. Just a calm, almost serene stillness, as if he'd faced far worse than a roadside interrogation and come out the other side unbroken. Dana took the documents, her fingers brushing the worn edges of the license. She glanced at it, her lips moving slightly as she read. 82 years old, she murmured, just loud enough for her partner, Officer Trey, to hear. Trey stood a few paces back, his posture relaxed but alert, his weight shifting from one foot to the other. He didn't step forward, didn't speak, but his eyes flicked between Dana and the old man, sensing the undercurrent of something he couldn't quite name. Dana's gaze lifted from the license to Franklin, her brow furrowing. "Sir," she said, her tone softening slightly, but still carrying a hint of challenge, "don't you think it's a little dangerous for someone your age to be riding a machine like this?" She gestured toward the Harley, its chrome dulled by years of dust and road, its frame solid but scarred. "This bike doesn't exactly look road safe either. When was the last time it was inspected?" Franklin said nothing. He didn't bristle at her words, didn't offer a defense. His hands rested lightly on his knees, his posture relaxed but not slouched, as if he were sitting not on a bike but in a command chair, waiting for the moment to act. His eyes, though, weren't on Dana. They drifted past her, out toward the open road that stretched beyond the gas station, a ribbon of asphalt cutting through the vast Montana landscape. In that gaze was a quiet longing, a memory of freedom, of purpose, of days when the road meant more than just a destination. Trey shifted again, his discomfort growing. He wasn't sure why this stop felt different, why the old man's silence seemed to carry more weight than any argument could. He glanced at Dana, wondering if she felt it too, but her focus remained on Franklin, her jaw set, her patience thinning. Across the lot, behind the streaked windows of the gas station's convenience store, Marty Ellison stood frozen, a pot of coffee hovering mid-pour in his hand. The rich, bitter scent filled the air, but Marty barely noticed. His attention was locked on the scene unfolding outside, his eyes narrowing as he took in every detail. A Desert Storm veteran with a limp that never quite healed and a steel rod in his right leg, Marty had run this station for nearly 20 years. He knew bikes, knew the growl of a well-tuned engine, the creak of a neglected frame. He knew veterans too, their quiet pride, their scars, the way they carried burdens no one else could see. And he knew Franklin Boon. Marty leaned closer to the glass, his breath fogging the pain. He'd seen Franklin ride through this stretch of Montana countless times, always alone, always with that same unhurried calm. But he'd never seen him stopped like this, not by anyone, let alone two local officers who couldn't possibly know who they were dealing with. A knot tightened in Marty's chest, a soldier's instinct flaring to life. Something wasn't right. His hand moved almost on its own, reaching for the landline behind the counter. A relic that hadn't rung in 3 years, its cord tangled from disuse. He dialed a number from memory, one only a handful of locals even knew. The operations desk at Camp Sheridan, the Army base 30 miles west. The line crackled, then connected. "This is Marty Ellison out at the corner stop," he said, his voice low but urgent. "I don't mean to raise alarm, but you might want to check your roster. There's an elderly man being questioned by 2 local officers. His name's Franklin Boon." A pause stretched across the line, filled with static. Then came a voice, sharp and immediate, cutting through the haze of routine. "Did you say Colonel Boon?" The question carried a weight that made Marty's grip tighten on the receiver. He nodded, though no one could see. "Yes, sir. That's the one." The response was swift, almost clipped. "Don't let anything happen to him. We're mobilizing now." The line went dead. Marty lowered the phone, his calloused hand lingering on the warm plastic. He turned back to the window, his eyes locking on Franklin, who hadn't moved an inch. The old man's stillness was unnerving, like the calm before a storm. But Marty knew things were about to shift. Outside, the morning carried on, oblivious. A few birds chattered from the telephone wires, their calls sharp against the quiet. A tractor rumbled past on a side road, its driver unaware of the drama unfolding at the gas station. Nothing about the moment screamed crisis, unless you looked at Marty Ellison's face. Through the window, he stood rigid, his jaw tight, his eyes burning with the intensity of a soldier bracing for impact. His heart pounded, a rhythm he hadn't felt since the deserts of Kuwait, where every moment carried the threat of chaos. Marty wasn't one to panic. He had seen too much for that. But the voice on the phone, its urgency, its recognition of Franklin's name, told him this was no longer just a routine stop. 30 miles away at Camp Sheridan, the control room buzzed with sudden purpose. Sergeant Major Lisa Grant slammed the secure line down, her movement swift and precise, like a conductor signaling the start of a symphony. She turned to a junior officer, her voice barking with an authority that filled the room. "Get Captain Evans. Tell him it's Boon, Colonel Franklin Boon. Situation unfolding now. Send transport and security. Move." The young officer stammered, "Yes, Sergeant," his face paling as he bolted from the room, the sergeant major's urgency infectious. Lisa Grant sank into her chair, exhaling sharply a sharp exhale, her hands gripping the edge of the desk. "Of all people, Boon," she whispered, her voice softer now, almost reverent. She remembered him vividly, not for any grand gesture, but for the quiet power he carried. Colonel Boon had that rare gift of command, a presence that didn't demand attention but earned it effortlessly. He never raised his voice, never needed to. One look from those steady eyes, and you stood straighter, worked harder, wanted to be better. Most of the officers in these halls had trained under him, their careers shaped by his example. If the locals were hassling him in public, this wasn't just a misunderstanding. It was a spark in a dry field, and it wouldn't burn out quietly. Back at the corner stop, the dynamic outside the gas station was shifting, though no one spoke of it yet. Dana's questions hung unanswered, her frustration growing. Franklin's silence wasn't defiance, but it carried a weight she couldn't ignore. Trey's unease deepened, his instincts telling him this stop was spiraling beyond their control. And inside the station, Marty stood watch, his gaze unwavering, a soldier's heart racing as the wheels set in motion began to roll. The Montana morning might have looked peaceful, but beneath its surface, something was stirring, something big. Officer Dana Kelso extended the driver's license back to the man seated on the weathered Harley. Her grip steady, but her voice carrying an edge honed by years of roadside encounters. "Sir, I asked you a question," she said, her tone unyielding, like steel tempered in routine. "Are you headed somewhere specific today?" Her eyes searched his face, probing for answers that went beyond words, sensing something unspoken beneath his silence. Franklin Boon lifted his gaze to meet hers, slow and deliberate, as if the act of looking at her required effort he wasn't eager to spend. His eyes held no defiance, no plea for mercy, but they carried a depth that unnerved her, a weight forged in decades of service, of standing on the edge of battlefields while wars flared and faded, of watching the world move on while the scars of sacrifice lingered in his bones. His weathered face, etched with lines like a map of forgotten campaigns, betrayed nothing but quiet resolve. "I'm going to get fuel," he said, his voice flat, stripped of emotion, as if the answer was all she was entitled to. Dana's jaw tightened, her irritation flaring at what she read as evasion, a subtle challenge to her authority. "That's not what I meant," she snapped, her words clipped, her patience fraying like a rope under strain. She felt the familiar surge of control she relied on in these moments, the need to assert order over ambiguity. Her partner, Officer Trey Daniels, stood a few steps back, his eyes drifting toward the gas station's grimy window. He noticed the clerk, Marty, had vanished from sight, leaving the storefront eerily still. A prickle of unease crawled up Trey's spine, like the hush before a storm breaks, the air growing taut with something he couldn't name. Donna pressed on, undeterred by the tension coiling around them. "We might need to bring you in for a wellness check, sir," she said, her voice firm, but tinged with a hint of concern she didn't fully acknowledge. "Your responses are delayed, and to be frank, this motorcycle doesn't look like it should be on the road." She gestured toward the Harley, its chrome dulled by years of sun and dust, its frame bearing the scars of countless miles. To her, it looked like a relic, a machine held together by stubbornness rather than mechanics. Franklin didn't flinch, didn't shift in his seat. His hands rested on the handlebars, steady as stone. "It runs just fine," he said, his voice low but resolute, carrying the quiet certainty of a man who had faced far greater challenges than a roadside interrogation. The words weren't a defense. They were a statement of fact, delivered without the need for validation. Trey, sensing the standoff hardening, took a cautious step forward. "Dana, maybe," he began, his voice soft, trying to ease the mounting friction. But Dana raised a hand, cutting him off without a glance. "I've got this," she said, her tone sharp, though a flicker of doubt gnawed at her. She didn't have it, not entirely, and deep down she felt the ground shifting beneath her authority. A faint vibration pulsed through the earth, so subtle at first it could have been mistaken for a passing truck. Then it grew, a low, guttural roar that seemed to rise from the bones of the desert itself. Tires churned against dirt. Engines growled with the precision of machines built for war. Dana's head snapped toward the sound, her brows knitting together as dust swirled on the horizon. From the curve of the road emerged a convoy of military Humvees, not one or two, but 12, their olive-drab bodies cutting through the haze like predators on the hunt. Each bore the unmistakable insignia of the U.S. Army, and the soldiers inside sat rigid, faces locked forward, their purpose etched in their posture. The lead Humvee flew a flag that snapped in the wind, its colors vivid against the barren landscape. The convoy didn't slow until it reached the gas station, then stopped with a synchronized jolt that sent a tremor through the ground. Dana's hand instinctively drifted to her sidearm, her fingers brushing the holster as her heart kicked into overdrive. She wasn't afraid, not yet, but the sudden arrival of such a force was a variable she hadn't prepared for. Franklin Boon remained still, his expression unchanged, as if the convoy's arrival was no more surprising than the sun climbing higher in the sky. Marty, the gas station clerk, stepped out from the doorway at that moment, wiping his grease-stained hands on a rag. His eyes widened as he took in the sight of soldiers spilling from the vehicles with mechanical precision, their boots hitting the ground in unison. He froze, the rag dangling from his fingers, his usual small-town nonchalance replaced by a mix of awe and apprehension. From the lead Humvee stepped a man, tall and gray-haired, his posture radiating the unyielding discipline of a lifelong warrior. His uniform was crisp, adorned with ribbons and medals that gleamed like fragments of a storied past. He moved with purpose, his eyes locking onto Franklin before shifting to the officers. He stopped a few paces away, squared his shoulders, and saluted, a sharp, deliberate gesture that carried the weight of tradition. "Who dared to stop Colonel Boon?" he said, his voice slicing through the air like a blade, commanding attention without effort. The words hung heavy, a challenge wrapped in reverence. Silence followed, thick and oppressive, as if the desert itself held its breath. Dana's fingers, still hovering near her holster, froze, not out of fear, but from the sheer force of the moment. She had never heard a greeting so steeped in respect, yet so laced with an unspoken warning. Her eyes darted to the man who had spoken, taking in the lines carved into his face, the steady gaze that seemed to see through her. His presence was a reminder of a world she had only glimpsed in newsreels, a world of duty and sacrifice that felt distant from her daily patrols. She turned slowly toward the voice, her breath catching as she registered the man's full presence. His dress greens were immaculate, the medals on his chest a testament to battles fought and decisions made under pressure. His spine was straight, his chin lifted, his boots planted as if he could stand there for days without faltering. He stepped forward and saluted again, this time directing the gesture solely at Franklin Boon, who sat unmoved on his Harley, a quiet titan weathering the storm of attention. "Colonel Boon," the man said, his voice softer now, tinged with a warmth that spoke of loyalty forged in fire. "Sir, we came as fast as we could." Franklin gave the faintest nod, a gesture so subtle it might have gone unnoticed by anyone else. But to the soldiers it was enough, a silent acknowledgement that carried the weight of shared history, of battles fought side by side, of debts that could never be repaid. Behind the officer, the soldiers had already dismounted, 50 in total, forming a tight, disciplined line. Their movements were sharp, not for display, but because it was how they'd been trained, by the man on the Harley, whose quiet presence commanded their allegiance. This was no mere show of force. It was a testament to a leader who had shaped them, who had led them through chaos and brought them home. They stood not to intimidate, but to protect one of their own, a man whose sacrifices had earned him their unwavering loyalty. The officer turned his gaze to Dana and Trey, his eyes steady but not unkind. "I'm Captain Nolan Graves, U.S. Army," he said, his voice calm but carrying an authority that needed no amplification. "Who issued the order to stop this man?" Dana stepped forward, her heart pounding, but her training holding her steady. She felt the weight of every eye on her, from the soldiers to Marty, who still clutched his rag like a lifeline. "Officer Dana Kelso, local patrol," she said, her voice faltering for a moment before she steadied it. "We stopped him due to concerns for his safety and the roadworthiness of his vehicle." She gripped her citation pad tightly, as if it could anchor her against the tide of this moment. Captain Graves didn't raise his voice, didn't need to. His presence was enough. "Did he break any laws?" he asked, his tone measured but piercing. "No, sir," Dana admitted, her grip on the pad tightening until her knuckles whitened. She felt the ground shift again, not physically, but in the way the situation had spiraled beyond her control. Did he resist? Did he threaten? Did he fail to comply? Graves pressed, each question landing like a stone in still water, sending ripples through her resolve. Dana stood silent, her mind racing as she grappled with the reality that her routine stop had collided with something far larger. A legacy of service, a bond of loyalty, a man whose quiet strength had summoned a convoy to his side. The air was thick with tension as Officer Dana Kelso stood before Colonel Franklin Boon, her initial bravado crumbling under the weight of her misjudgment. She had hesitated, her words faltering as she faced the weathered man astride his Harley, its faded chrome glinting under the midday sun. Her first instinct had been to assert authority, to challenge the man she assumed was just another aging biker causing a stir in their small town. But now, as the reality of who he was settled over her like a heavy fog, she felt the sting of shame creeping into her chest, tightening her throat. She hadn't spoken to him with malice, but with ignorance, and that felt worse somehow. Her eyes darted to the ground, unable to meet his steady, unyielding gaze. Captain Nolan Graves stepped closer, his boots crunching softly against the gravel-strewn pavement. His presence was commanding, not because of his rank, but because of the quiet conviction in his movements. Behind him, the 50 soldiers who had accompanied him shifted forward in unison, not a single one out of step. It wasn't a show of force. It was a testament to their shared loyalty, a silent vow to stand by the man they revered. Their uniforms were crisp, their faces stoic, but their eyes burned with pride for the figure at the center of this moment. Graves's voice, steady but laced with a raw edge of emotion, broke the silence. He spoke of Boon's service. 3 wars: Vietnam, Desert Storm, Afghanistan. Decades of sacrifice etched into the lines of his face, each one a story of survival, loss, and unspoken heroism. Graves's words carried the weight of truth, each syllable a tribute to a man who had trained generations, including himself, and earned honors that outshone the entire precinct's accolades combined. 2 silver stars, a Distinguished Service Cross, and countless battlefield commendations. Medals Boon had never flaunted, never even acknowledged. Graves paused, his voice catching as he fought to keep his composure. He wasn't just recounting facts, he was unraveling a piece of his own soul. Boon, he explained, was a man who spoke little because words could never capture the horrors he'd witnessed, the lives he'd saved, the comrades he'd buried. His silence wasn't defiance, it was wisdom born from years of learning that haste kills, that reckless decisions cost lives. Dana's cheeks flushed as she recalled her earlier jab at Boon's motorcycle, the one she'd mocked as a rusted relic. Now, Graves's words painted a different picture. That same bike had carried Boon through the chaotic streets of Saigon during the final desperate evacuation. Its worn frame wasn't decay, it was a living artifact, a testament to survival, to history itself. Dana's stomach churned with regret, her earlier confidence replaced by a humbling realization of how wrong she'd been. Boon remained still, his posture unyielding yet dignified, as if the weight of the moment didn't faze him. His eyes, weathered but sharp, held no trace of anger or triumph. He was a man who had faced far worse than a misguided officer's assumptions. Dana's voice was barely a whisper when she spoke, her apology soft but sincere. "I didn't know." The words felt inadequate, a feeble attempt to bridge the gap between her ignorance and his legacy. Graves's response was curt but not unkind. "No, you didn't. But maybe you should have asked before judging." His tone wasn't accusatory, it was a call to reflection, a reminder that assumptions carry consequences. The townspeople who had gathered along the sidewalk, initially drawn by the spectacle of what they thought would be a routine confrontation, now stood in reverent silence. Their phones, once raised to capture a moment of mockery, now recorded something far greater, a living legend revealed. The air felt heavier, charged with the weight of Boon's story. He dismounted his Harley with a slow, deliberate grace, his movements betraying none of the age that lined his face. He didn't need to speak to command respect. His presence alone was enough. When he finally did speak, his voice was low, steady, and carried the weight of a lifetime. Respect isn't a uniform. It's how you carry yourself. It wasn't a rebuke, but a lesson, delivered with the quiet authority of someone who had spent decades teaching others to be better. Graves turned to Boon, his posture softening slightly. "Sir, would you like an escort home?" he asked, his voice tinged with deference. Boon shook his head, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "I think the lesson's loud enough," he replied. With that, he swung his leg back over the Harley, the key turned, and the engine roared to life, a deep, resonant growl that seemed to echo from another era. The soldiers parted, forming a quarter of honor, their bodies rigid in salute as Boon rode forward. The dust kicked up behind him, swirling in the air like memories of battles long past. The sound of the Harley faded into the distance, but the silence that followed was profound, heavy with the weight of what had just transpired. Dana stood rooted to the spot, her eyes stinging, not from the must but from the shame that clung to her like a second skin. She felt exposed, not just to the crowd but to herself, her assumptions laid bare. Beside her, Officer Trey Daniels lowered his head, his own thoughts a tangle of awe and regret. The soldiers began to reform their ranks, their movements precise but subdued, as if they too were processing the magnitude of the moment. Graves lingered, his gaze sweeping over the small crowd of onlookers. They were no longer just spectators, they were witnesses to history. "I know you're all wondering who he is," he said, his voice steady but warm, addressing not the cameras but the people behind them. He paused, as if weighing how much of Boon's story he could share without betraying the man's quiet code. Colonel Franklin Boon served in 3 of America's hardest-fought wars: Vietnam, Desert Storm, Afghanistan. But he's more than a soldier. He's a quiet commander, the kind who doesn't need to raise his voice to make you listen. When he walks into a room, you feel it. You stand taller. You want to be better. Graves's voice grew softer, more personal as he continued. He was one of the first to train special operations at Fort Bragg. Over his career, he mentored over 300 officers, many of whom now wear stars of their own. He's been wounded twice, refused medical retirement, even refused medals, saying they belonged to the men who didn't make it home. A murmur rippled through the crowd, a mix of awe and disbelief. "He's the reason I joined," Graves admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "When I was a cocky recruit, he didn't break me down. He built me up, made me believe I could be more. He's done that for countless others." A teenager in the crowd, no older than 17, raised a tentative hand. "Why doesn't anyone know him? Why isn't his name in history books?" The question hung in the air, innocent yet piercing. Graves offered a sad smile, his eyes distant. "Because he didn't want it to be," he said simply. "That's who he is." Dana swallowed hard, the truth settling over her like a weight she wasn't sure she could carry. She felt small, not because anyone had diminished her, but because she had diminished herself with her assumptions. The crowd dispersed slowly, their whispers carrying fragments of Boon's story. The soldiers returned to their vehicles, but the emotional gravity of the moment lingered, a reminder that some lessons don't fade with the sound of an engine. The realization hit Officer Dana Kelso like a boulder crashing into her chest, heavy and unyielding. She had pulled over Franklin Boon for reasons that now felt painfully shallow. His silence, his weathered appearance, the rusty motorcycle that didn't meet her polished standards. She judged him by the surface, by the denim and leather that cloaked a man whose life was a testament to duty and sacrifice, qualities she'd only encountered in the pages of training manuals. Standing before Captain Nolan Graves, Dana felt the weight of her mistake pressing against her ribs, a mix of shame and regret churning in her gut. She'd followed protocol, yes, but protocol hadn't prepared her for the depth of a man like Boon. Graves's gaze was steady, his eyes piercing, yet not unkind. His voice, once sharp with authority, softened into something instructive, almost paternal. "Officer Kelso," he said, "your actions weren't malicious. You did what you were trained to do. But training doesn't always see the valor hidden beneath a worn jacket. It doesn't always recognize the stories etched into a man's scars. We need to do better, not just follow rules, but truly see the people behind them." His words landed with quiet force, each one sinking into Dana's consciousness. She nodded, her throat tight. "I understand, sir," she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. "I was wrong." The admission felt raw, like peeling back a layer of herself she hadn't known existed. Graves turned to the soldiers standing nearby, their faces a mix of solemnity and respect. With a single nod, he signaled them back to their Humvees. The engines roared to life with mechanical precision, a stark contrast to the stillness that lingered in the air. The small crowd that had gathered didn't disperse. Something had shifted in that Montana town, a subtle but profound change in how they saw Franklin Boon and men like him. These were men who carried their burdens quietly, whose scars spoke louder than their words, who asked not for recognition, but for understanding. From that moment, Colonel Boon's name became a quiet beacon in the community, a reminder of what had been overlooked and what could never be forgotten again. As the last Humvee vanished down the dusty road, the town began to hum with life. Cell phone videos of the encounter spread like wildfire across Facebook, capturing the moment when a military convoy saluted a man mistaken for a vagrant. By nightfall, Colonel Boon was trending locally, his story rippling outward. Within 24 hours, regional news outlets had seized the narrative. Veteran mistaken for vagrant, honored by military convoy. The story carried a mix of pride and unease, a celebration of Boon's service, and a quiet indictment of the assumptions that had led to his humiliation. Inside the Billings County Sheriff's Department, the phones rang relentlessly. Complaints poured in, mingled with praise and demands for answers. Sheriff Les McAdams, a man in his 50s with broad shoulders and a calm demeanor honed by 3 decades in uniform, felt the weight of the moment. He'd faced blizzards, budget cuts, and political storms, but nothing quite like this. A public reckoning over a mistake that cut deep into the values he swore to uphold. When the call came from Camp Sheridan just after 8 a.m. the next day, McAdams answered it himself, his voice steady, but his mind racing. "Sheriff McAdams, this is Captain Nolan Graves," the voice on the line said. "We need to talk. Unveiling. Talk. Not about punishment, but about partnership." The conversation was brief but heavy with purpose. Graves didn't threaten legal action, and Boon wasn't pressing charges, but the message was unmistakable. This could not happen again. Not in their town, not to their veterans. McAdams hung up the phone, his jaw tight, resolve hardening in his chest. By noon, he'd called an emergency meeting. In the precinct's break room, officers sat in folding chairs, coffee cups forgotten on the tables. The room was hushed, not out of fear, but out of a shared introspection. Dana Kelso sat beside McAdams, her uniform pristine but her eyes downcast, carrying the weight of the previous day like a stone. McAdams stood at the front, his presence commanding yet approachable. "I'm not here to point fingers," he began, his voice steady but laced with conviction. "But I'm also not here to pretend yesterday was okay. We made a mistake, a big one. A man who has given his life, not just once, but time and again, was treated like a problem instead of a person." He glanced at Dana, giving her a nod. She rose slowly, her heart pounding, but her voice firm. "I stopped a man because he was old, because his bike looked unsafe, because he didn't answer fast enough," she said, her words deliberate. "I thought I was protecting him, protecting the community, but the truth is I never gave him a chance to show who he was. I assumed." Her gaze swept the room, meeting the eyes of her colleagues. Some nodded in quiet agreement. Others stared at the floor, grappling with their own reflections. "I didn't just stop a veteran," Dana continued, her voice softening but growing heavier. "I stopped a living example of everything we're supposed to stand for. Duty, sacrifice, resilience. I've apologized to Colonel Boon in person. But that's not enough. I want to do more." The room absorbed her words, the silence thick with understanding. McAdams stepped forward again, his tone resolute. "Starting today, we're implementing a new protocol. We'll work directly with Camp Sheridan to train every officer, not just on recognizing military service, but on approaching people with respect and listening before we act." It wasn't empty rhetoric. The following week, every officer, from rookies to seasoned veterans, stepped onto the training grounds of Camp Sheridan. The sessions were immersive, designed to bridge the gap between protocol and humanity, to teach them how to see the valor beneath the denim and leather, to honor the stories hidden in silence. For Dana, each session was a step toward redemption, a chance to rebuild not just her understanding, but her sense of purpose. And for the town, it was the beginning of a deeper commitment, to never again let a man like Colonel Boon be forgotten. The morning sun hung low over the Montana plains, casting long shadows across the open fields as Officer Dana Kelso steered her cruiser down a gravel driveway. Her heart thudded in her chest, not with the urgency of a call, but with the weight of something unfinished. Nearly a week had passed since the incident at Marty's gas station, the one that had briefly stirred the quiet town of Willow Creek. The local headlines had moved on, the buzz of gossip had faded, and life had slipped back into its gentle rhythm. Yet for her, the memory of that day clung like dust to her boots. She'd gone through the motions since then, attended the trauma-informed training at Camp Sheridan, stood before her colleagues, and admitted her misstep. She'd absorbed lessons on cultural sensitivity, on reading silence not as defiance, but as dignity, on seeing stillness not as resistance, but as resilience. But deep in her core, Dana knew those steps weren't enough. Not for protocol, not for the department, but for her own soul. She needed to face Colonel Franklin Boon, not as an officer, but as a person carrying the weight of her own regret. The driveway stretched long and winding, flanked by golden fields where cattle grazed lazily, their breath visible in the crisp, windless air. At its end stood a modest white farmhouse, its rusted tin roof glinting faintly in the dawn. A small barn leaned slightly to one side, weathered but sturdy, and a wind chime hung from the porch, swaying gently as if it held memories of breezes long gone. Beneath a towering cottonwood tree, half shrouded in shadow, sat Boone's Harley-Davidson, its chrome catching slivers of sunlight like a quiet promise. Nearby, a green John Deere tractor stood mid-repair, its hood propped open like it had paused mid-sentence, tools scattered around it. Dana parked her cruiser by the split-rail fence, her hands lingering on the steering wheel as she took a steadying breath. Stepping out, she felt the crunch of gravel under her boots, the sound sharp in the stillness. Her uniform felt heavier today, not because of the badge or the belt, but because of the humility she carried. Before she could speak, he saw her. Colonel Franklin Boon stood beside the tractor, his coveralls streaked with grease, his sleeves rolled up to reveal arms weathered by time and labor. He didn't startle or scowl, didn't shift his stance or narrow his eyes. He simply straightened, his broad shoulders squaring as he wiped his hands on a faded rag, his gaze steady and unreadable. There was no hostility in his posture, only patience, a quiet kind of strength that made Dana's rehearsed words falter in her throat. "Colonel Boon," she said, her voice softer than she'd intended as she crossed the dirt toward him. "May I speak with you?" He gave a single nod, his eyes briefly scanning her face, not with judgment, but with curiosity, as if he were trying to understand what brought her here. "Coffee's fresh," he said, his voice low and gravelly, gesturing toward the porch. The invitation was simple, but it carried a warmth that eased the knot in Dana's chest. Inside, the farmhouse smelled of cedar and strong black coffee, a scent that wrapped around her like a memory of simpler times. The furniture was modest, worn wooden chairs, a faded couch, a table with scratches that told stories of years gone by. Everything was clean, intentional, as if each item had earned its place. On a shelf above the fireplace sat a folded American flag, its edges crisp, resting beside a framed photo of a woman whose smile seemed to hold the echo of laughter, a joy that once filled this space. Dana's eyes lingered there for a moment, wondering who she was to Boone, what stories she'd shared with him before time or fate had taken her away. They sat at the kitchen table, two mismatched mugs steaming between them. Dana's hands wrapped around hers, the warmth grounding her as she searched for the right words. Boone didn't rush her, didn't fill the silence with small talk. He simply waited, his hands resting on the table, his eyes calm but piercing, as if he could see the storm of thoughts swirling in her mind. I needed to come here," Dana began, her voice trembling slightly, "to say thank you, and to say I'm sorry. I didn't see you for who you were that day. I saw a stranger, someone I was trained to size up, to assess for threats, and I judged you before I knew you." Boone's gaze drifted to the window, where the fields stretched endless under the morning sky. For a moment he was silent, his expression unreadable, and Dana wondered if she'd overstepped, if her apology was too late or too small. Then he spoke, his voice quiet but steady, like a river carving its path through stone. "You saw what most folks see," he said, "an old man with a bike that's seen better days. You were taught to look for danger, to keep yourself safe. That's not your fault, Officer Kelso." The words landed gently, but they stung all the same. Dana's throat tightened, her fingers tightening around the mug. "But I judged you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I assumed things about you, and I was wrong." Boone's eyes met hers then, and there was something in them. Something kind, something weathered. like a man who'd seen enough of the world to know its flaws and still choose grace. And then you learned, he said simply. That's what matters. The silence that followed wasn't heavy. It was warm, like the coffee in her hands, like the sunlight spilling through the window. Dana let it settle, let it wrap around her as she processed his words. She'd come here expecting judgment, maybe even anger. But instead she found forgiveness. Not the loud performative kind, but the quiet, unshakable kind that changes you from the inside out. Can I ask you something? She said softly, her curiosity overcoming her hesitation. Why didn't you tell anyone who you were? You could have said something that day, told me about your service, your rank. Why didn't you? Boone leaned back in his chair, a faint smile tugging at his lips. Not a smile of pride or amusement, but something gentler, something that spoke of a man who'd long ago made peace with his past. Because what I did isn't who I am, he said. Medals, titles, they're just things. They don't change how you treat a person. And respect, that's not something you wear like a uniform. It's something you give, something you live by. His words landed like a lesson she hadn't known she needed, simple yet profound. Dana felt a warmth spread through her, not just from the coffee, but from the understanding that this man, this quiet, unassuming man, had chosen to meet her mistake not with demands for recognition, but with mercy. The conversation didn't end with grand declarations or promises. It ended quietly, as it began, with two people sharing a moment of truth. In the weeks that followed, Willow Creek began to change, not in its landscape or its routines, but in its heart. People started to see the world through new eyes. An old man crossing the street wasn't just someone slowing them down. He might be a person who had once cleared paths through jungles or deserts for others. A worn leather jacket wasn't just a sign of age. It was a relic of history, a testament to a life lived with purpose. Dana continued her work as an officer, but she wasn't the same woman who'd been before. She asked questions now, listened before she spoke, and paused before she reacted. Every time she passed a veteran or anyone who carried themselves with a certain quiet strength, something in her, a subtle shift, not born of guilt, but of understanding, a recognition that every person she met was a story she hadn't yet heard. As for Colonel Boon, life on the farm went on unchanged, at least on the surface. The Harley still roared to life each morning, its rumble a steady heartbeat echoing through the fields. The tractor still needed fixing, its parts stubborn but slowly yielding under his patient hands. He rose at dawn, drank his coffee black, and worked the land with the same quiet dignity he'd always carried. But something had shifted, not in him, but in the people around him. Neighbors waved as he rode by, their gestures no longer tinged with pity or indifference, but with respect. A quiet nod to a hand raised, an acknowledgement of a man whose story they might not know, but whose presence they valued. And maybe that's the truest lesson of all. Heroes don't always stand on battlefields or wear their scars for the world to see. Sometimes they're found in the quiet places, on a porch, at a gas station, astride a motorcycle older than the officer who pulls them over. Their service doesn't end when the war does. It lives on in the way they move through the world, in the quiet dignity they offer to everyone they meet. For Dana Kelso, that lesson was a gift, one she'd carry with her always, a reminder that the greatest strength lies not in power or authority, but in the courage to listen, to see, and to learn.